Welcome, everyone. My name is Sierra Sanchez, webinar producer with CGLR. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. We invite you to connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR. On Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. And on LinkedIn, subscribe to us at Campaign for GLR. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. The webinar will begin shortly. It will be recorded and shared with you afterwards. Alrighty, welcome again. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping details. First, we'd love you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure to select both panelists and attendees when responding so that we all know who is here. The webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A link to the recording, as well as any resources, slides, and bios shared during the conversation, will be sent in a follow-up email to all who registered. Finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during closing and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. We also invite you to join us for some of our upcoming webinars. Apologies, it looks like we had a repeat on this slide. But on June 27th next week, we will have an exciting doubleheader, starting with a session co-sponsored by the Patterson Foundation on what does it mean to drive systems change in digital access. The following session at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll have a session on technology-assisted teaching and learning, continuing the conversation. And on July 11th, we'll have a session on Shakar's Institute's 50 State Report on Literacy Promotion. Information and registration for all of these sessions will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope you can join us. Sorry about that. There we go. Joining you now is Hillary Jones with Foundations, Inc. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra. Thank you all for being here today and joining us for this session, Strengthening Kindergarten to Improve Children's Pre-K through third grade experiences. This is part of our Promoting Impactful Teaching and Learning in Kindergarten series that the Campaign for Grade Level Reading and New America have come together and really tried to host a series of sessions where we explore literacy, math, and social emotional development in kindergarten and how educators and districts and even states can play a part in transforming this role of kindergarten. So the series began in October of 2022 with a pivotal year, kindergarten's important role in students' education, where we talk about kindergarten as the sturdy bridge between pre-K and early grades, how the sturdy bridge has to work, it needs to have a strong foundation, and the importance of relationships for building a reading grade. In November of 2022, we talked about play plus academics plus relationship and teaching in the way kindergartners learn best. And then as we began 2023, we talked about how states, districts, and educators are strengthening kindergarten. In February, we looked at creating an environment and conditions for thriving kindergartners and all of the variety of things that we can bring in to help students really engage in the compelling space where they want to be. And then in March, we talked about promoting high quality math and science learning in kindergarten, as well as we've had in April and just earlier today, 2 funder to funder sessions where we talked about funding around this field and in this area. And so as we begin this session today, I'm excited to continue this conversation. I believe it may be our final one around kindergarten for a season. And so we want to say thank you to New America and especially to Laura, who's put all of the work into planning much of these sessions. And so Laura is going to be our moderator for our session once again today. She's a senior fellow and advisor on early and elementary education with the Education Policy Program at New America. And her work focuses on transforming kindergarten, promoting policy and practice that will strengthen the transition into kindergarten and the early grades of elementary school. Before joining New America over 7 years ago, Laura worked with several policy organizations in Washington, D.C., including the Institute for Educational Leadership and the Forum for Education and Democracy. Laura also helped implement youth programs in the city of Orlando and was a fourth grade teacher. And so, Laura, it is a pleasure to have you here once again today.
Thank you so much again, Hillary. Thanks to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, and thanks to all of you for being here with us today and participating in this conversation once again on kindergarten. But today we're gonna do a little bit, something a little bit different. We're gonna zoom out a bit. Over the last 2 decades, there has been really a growing recognition of the importance and benefits of public pre-K. We've seen pre-K expansion in public elementary schools and local communities. And while in some communities, early childhood education programs, including pre-K, continue to be siloed and often unavailable to many families, in a lot of places, both school district officials and elementary school principals are recognizing the value of pre-K and regardless of where it is delivered, and thinking of it as an equal and essential part of elementary schools. And while this is going on, kindergarten through 3rd grade, however, has been largely neglected. And while federal, state, and local agencies continue to work on the availability, affordability, and quality of pre-K and other EC options, we've also got to work to create conditions that enable seamless transition into and out of kindergarten, better align pre-K and kindergarten and the early grades, and promote developmentally informed approaches to teaching and learning pre-K through 3rd grade. And without this work, as we've seen in many places, children's learning and developmental gains in pre-K programs will be more likely to continue to wane in early elementary school. In the last 5 sessions, as Hillary outlined, of this webinar series, we've largely focused on the important role of kindergarten, what good kindergarten looks like, what state and local school districts are doing to make changes to strengthen kindergarten experiences. And like I said, we're going to zoom out today. And we really want to get to what kindergarten's place is in a well-aligned, joyful, and developmentally informed PreK-3rd continuum that enables each and every child to thrive. So before we start into the conversation, I'm excited to introduce our panelists today. We have with us Gloria Corral. Gloria is the president and CEO of the Parent Institute for Quality Education. Welcome, Gloria. We have Anya Hurwitz. Anya is the executive director of SEAL, which is Sobrato Early Academic Language, an educational nonprofit working to ensure all dual language learners and English learners in California learn, thrive, and lead. And we have Chantel Meek. Chantel is a professor of practice and the founding director of the Children's Equity Project at Arizona State University, And you'll also hear on video from Connie Hall. Connie is a kindergarten teacher at Lloyd Diedrich Elementary School in Sparks, Nevada. She began her teaching career in 1994 and has taught children from nursery up through 3rd grade. And I had the privilege of visiting her classroom in May. And you can find out more about each of these panelists in the bio sheet that Hillary just put in the chat. So let's get started with a really important question. What does a well-aligned, joyful, and developmentally informed PreK-3rd continuum mean for different populations of children, particularly dual language learners, children with disabilities, and children from families with low incomes? And Gloria, I'd love to start our conversation with you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Laura, so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. That's such an important question. I have spent half of my career in the 0 to 5 space, and the other half in kind of the more traditional K-16 space. And the reason why I say that is because this alignment around understanding developmentally appropriate practice that comes from a well-structured early childhood experience, we now know the science is very clear, is the foundation through which children develop those really strong skills that as they continue on to kinder, first, second, and third, really are able to be strengthened. And I say that because what it looks like is actually recognizing three really important things. One is that children's ability to thrive is based on their ability to feel welcome, for their families to feel welcomed, for their culture and their community to be valued. So that remains constant in the P3 space. The other, which is really important, is that there is a recognition that in order for especially families and children from low-income communities, that valuing the community assets is seminal. And what that means is that seeing the community and the family as an asset, meaning they have different stories, they have different contexts, they have different cultures perhaps, and there's richness in that. And I think that's a really undervalued construct. There's often this deficit mindset that children, especially from low-income families, may not have. And then there's a list: housing, stable food, access to books, right? And I think that really undermines all the richness that comes that are critical to having a joyful, aligned curriculum, is by taking those experiences and bringing them into the classroom in a way that enables the classroom to be an extension of home, and the home to be an extension of the learning that happens at school. And so I think this symbiotic recognition is very important. The third thing that really needs to happen is recognizing, I think, also that teachers and the context of K3 really needs to take some lessons learned from high quality early childhood experiences. And I think that is both from a pedagogical standpoint, and Dr. Meeks and others will speak to that, but really from a pedagogical standpoint, enabling the teachers to really see families as an integral part of the learning that happens at school, and all those 18 hours that happen outside of school, right? That the learning is a continuum, that the approaches and the pedagogical ways in which language acquisition, for example, I know my colleague Anya will talk about this, right? Doesn't happen in the context of 7:30 to 2 o'clock, right? Learning acquisition happens in the context of waking up and going to sleep, right? And it's language acquisition, numeracy, self-regulation. And so I think those three pillars really enable families, families' home language, cultural community, and importantly, the richness that comes even when, or specifically within the context of communities that are underinvested. And so, Laura, I would say that those are the constructs. I think the best and most aligned and joyful learning happens when families are invited and welcome to be part of the learning, right? By sharing their culture, by sharing their anecdotes, by valuing the abuelas that might be gathering at the park, right? The incredible amount of sophisticated timekeeping that needs to happen when a mom has to patch out a schedule of buses, right? Talk about highly complex skill sets, right? I think that's how we need to be looking at how curriculum, materials, environment in a early learning context actually get extended into a more traditional kinder to 3 context. And unfortunately, a lot of the materials don't reflect that, right? And so it really then means that the teacher's ability to know the families, to listen to the families, to bring families into the conversation at the school. And I will leave it here, but for the teachers and the educators to be part of the community, right? This has to be a symbiotic relationship where families are welcome and the teachers and the educators are part of the community because they know it. So they would know it takes 3 buses to get from point A to point B, right? At the library, right? They would know that and they would be able to build it into their valuing of the curriculum and having families feel welcome.
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you especially for bringing in the important role of families. And we know that, every child is going to come into the classroom with different experiences and challenges and assets, and valuing the assets that all children bring and their families is so important, and creates, as you said, it can create a much more inclusive and engaging learning environment. And I think also the point about what K-3 educators can be learning from our, early educator on the pre-K, and even, among younger children's side, there's a lot to learn from each other there. So important. Anya, let's hear from you next on dual language learners.
Thank you, Laura. It's an honor to participate in this panel and to join the campaign for grade level reading once again. The vision at SEAL is to develop thriving lifelong learners with the skills, knowledge, and confidence to participate and lead in and across their multiple language and cultural worlds. So a well-aligned, joyful, developmentally informed, equity-focused P3 continuum is essential to achieving this vision. And for dual language learners, known as English learners in the K-12 realm, it is critical that this continuum be asset-based, as we just heard, and committed to meaningful access to the full curriculum, centering dual language learners through shared responsibility. Essential components of this continuum include, first, as we also heard, family partnerships, strong, authentically respectful partnerships with families and communities that celebrate and build from the languages and cultures of the family and the community. Next, teacher capacity building and teacher agency, so that teachers can implement research-based, joyful, linguistically and culturally sustaining instruction. Another critical component of the P3 continuum is language and literacy development, comprehensive, rich, research-based literacy and language development that is integrated across all content areas and aspects of learning and child development. Our partnerships with families must be authentic, truly honoring families and communities, centering their assets and funds of knowledge, and these partnerships must be grounded in genuine collaboration and respect. An asset-based orientation means affirming and inclusive, valuing and working to sustain and develop home languages with a long-term goal of biliteracy. A truly asset-based orientation actively eradicates deficiency paradigms related to language, culture, race, and immigration status. These deficit paradigms have been and are deeply ingrained in practices, systems, and mindsets. So we eradicate them by recognizing that cultures, languages, and life experiences children and their families bring to education are valuable resources for their learning and contributions to the school community. Culturally and linguistically affirming learning is a cornerstone of effective and equitable education for dual language learners and for all children. The focus on meaningful access to the full curriculum includes rectifying vestiges of longstanding exclusionary practices and beliefs by providing culturally and linguistically sustaining instruction across all standards, all content areas. This is critical to closing opportunity gaps. This is critical to equity. And this is critical to ensuring that schooling is interesting, that learning is grounded in content that is engaging and rigorous, and builds knowledge, providing the mirrors and windows into the world that children need and deserve. So the focus is on language-rich learning, pedagogy that supports and promotes expressive, complex language development throughout the curriculum, integrating language, literacy, and content in ways that leverage a child's multiple languages. This includes providing complex but comprehensible input and scaffolding, so children have access and support to produce increasingly sophisticated language and higher order thinking. We know from research, specifically the federally funded Reading for Understanding initiative, that knowledge, language, and comprehension are deeply connected. Language is the vehicle of all learning. So when we create language-rich learning, we support the learning for all children, but it is essential for dual language learners. Building teacher capacity and teacher agency are key to equity-focused, responsive teaching and learning. This capacity and agency is the vehicle of differentiation. So as teachers differentiate for the actual learners in their classrooms, they must build on children's strengths, assets, and specific needs. Therefore, teachers must be empowered to make instructional decisions, and it's critical that they're supported through an infrastructure of professional learning and collaboration. These are the conditions necessary for effective, responsive teaching. So an aligned, joyful, developmentally appropriate, equity-focused P3 continuum is student-centered and engaging. It supports language-rich, culturally and linguistically sustaining learning that is joyful, relevant, active, participatory, and inquiry-based. It is grounded in high-level content and intellectually rich activities while building foundational skills.
Thank you, Anya, and thank you. I'm seeing the theme of the importance of, families and recognizing children's assets. And I think, one thing that you bring in is just that the important role of educators in really creating those language-rich environments, which doesn't just have to be an ELA, as you mentioned, but can be something that's integrated as part of all content areas. And really that's the way that is important for young kids to learn best, right? All kids. So Chantel, what would you respond to our question? I know you'll be bringing in some of your expertise on children with disabilities.
Thank you, Laura. I think to start, I would echo everything that my colleagues just mentioned, right? It means really aligning what we know from neuroscience and learning science and how we learn and how we're translating that, right, into the classroom and into our practices. Of course, right, culturally sustaining pedagogy, effective instruction, bilingualism, and biliteracy for dual language learners in particular, attention to families, really prioritizing joy and well-being alongside academics. And that means figuring out how to measure that, right, as another thing that we value. Bringing back play, right, free open play as well as guided play and intentional play and direct instruction when we need it, right, balancing those things out. But I think the biggest thing is really kind of that clause on equity, right, and how do we operationalize that, and what does that really mean? How do we move beyond just saying it to doing it? And what does that look like? And so that's what we focus on at the Children's Equity Project, which is really trying to operationalize equity into policy, into practice. For the question at hand, right, in kindergarten, it has to mean a focus on opportunity gaps and targeting and investing in where we have fallen short as systems, right? A few of those areas have already been mentioned, right? Language of instruction and culturally sustaining pedagogy for dual language learners and others. Discipline, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Inclusion for kids with disabilities. So what does joyful, developmentally appropriate kindergarten mean, right? I think it has to mean focusing on culture and climate, right? Really taking a hard look at our rules and distinguishing that mindset, right? Is the goal control for the sake of control, which we see way too often, or is it one of child agency and trust and parent partnerships that's the mindset that's driving, right? A lot less sit like this, walk like this, talk now, don't talk now, right? And a lot more optimizing learning and social opportunities across the day, fostering friendships, fostering relationships, because we know, again, from early childhood development, brain science, and so on, that human beings learn through social interactions, right? And in the context of warm relationships in particular, and that is particularly true for our youngest kids, including our kindergartners. So it means really thinking about our behavior guidance, right? And seeing that as a learning opportunity and developmentally appropriate in the context of those relationships, and really rejecting harsh discipline. There's a new National Academies report that was released just last month looking at opportunity gaps in particular, and it included the early grades and kindergarten. And so, I can touch on that a little bit later, but it includes thinking about kids with disabilities as well. And so what does it mean for kids with disabilities? It means ensuring that they have access to what everybody else has access to, right? It means full inclusion across all activities. And that means all kids, right? All kids should have the opportunity to receive their services and to be in inclusive settings in the least restrictive environment. And that is just not happening yet. Unfortunately, across the country. So it means appropriate accommodations, it means individualized instruction, it means full accessibility, not just to the physical space, but to the teacher, to the curriculum, to peers, to the content and instruction. It means that DLLs with disabilities, right, have access to instruction in their home language as well, and we're not leaving them out of those opportunities. So I think I'll stop right there.
Thanks, Chantel. And you, I think, made a lot of important points, but something that stuck out with me was this idea of, we value, particularly in the, younger years, joy and well-being. Oh, well, we should probably value that, across the full continuum. But how do we measure everything that we value? Is there a way to measure it, to make it have the same value and importance as the academic areas, and ensure we're, particularly in the early years and early grades, bringing back in, as you said, the play-based learning and the free play and all of those other pieces that we've talked about earlier in this in this series. And I want to stick with you for a moment. And you mentioned some things about discipline and behavior and, control in the classrooms. And, something we know from research is that children with disabilities are often disciplined at, higher rates, as are children of color. Can you discuss more about discipline policies and systems that really impact our young elementary students, and what's working, and what do you think still needs to change?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge issue of focus that I've been working on for at least a decade now. In 2014, we got the first set of pre-K data from the Civil Rights Data Collection, national collection that showed us, right, that we had the same stark racial disparities in pre-K as we've had, right, in the K-12 system. And I think at that time, I can't believe that was nearly 10 years ago, there was a lot of policy movement to try to address that issue. And a lot of it kind of went up. It wasn't only pre-K, but it kind of went up to the early grades as well. And so we, at the time, the Obama administration, right, was in the process of updating the child care regulation and the Head Start regulation, and they both included now explicit mentions of expulsion and suspension in the case of Head Start as well. And there was a whole bunch of policy movement at the time. A lot of states and localities and districts really establishing their own policies, a lot of age-based or grade-based limitations on suspension and expulsion. Just between 2019 and 2022, I think over 150 bills related to discipline were enacted across 41 different states. And what we saw, though, is kind of compared to where we were back in 2014 when that first set of data came out, to the most recent data collection for the civil rights data collection of that age group, is that the rates have improved, at least in that particular age group, but the disparities remain nearly untouched or basically the same. And so what we see is here, Black children across ages, across time, across settings, across states. So we did an analysis looking at pre-K through elementary school. And Black children are disproportionately excluded no matter what state you live in. The rate of disparity varies, but like the same remains true everywhere you go. Across types of discipline. So there's corporal punishment, there's suspension, there's expulsion, there's a number of different categories collected with that federal data. And again, it's remarkably consistent, right? For Black children, I think it's important to say up front, right? Black children do not behave worse. And there is no research suggesting that they engage in more frequent or more severe or any type of worse behavior, right, to align with this huge overrepresentation and consistent overrepresentation we see in the data with discipline. And so there's been a lot of research that's been done thinking about the misalignment in kind of behavioral expectations, right, the perceptions of behavior, and how those influence our discipline decisions, how bias is a really big driving factor, and that manifests really differently in across different settings. But we see there's been studies that show that Black children are scrutinized more, right? We're just looking at them more often. There's studies that have found perceptions that Black children are older than they are, or need less support, are rated as needing less support, and emotional support. So there's all these pieces that kind of work together and impact the way that we perceive behavior, and then the decisions that we make based on those perceptions of our behavior. Who gets to be a kid and who doesn't, right? And that kind of is different. We see a really stark disparity there. As you mentioned, children with disabilities also disproportionately excluded, but another area is restraint and seclusion is another type of harsh discipline that is unfortunately used as discipline. And we see children with disabilities hugely overrepresented there. So they're about 12% of school enrollment, but 71% of restraint, about 66% of seclusion. And just as a reminder, right, seclusion means locking a child in a room by themselves without the ability to get out. So this is happening, right, across the country. This is collected as part of federal data and the civil rights data collection. And we see that when we kind of zoom in to that type of discipline, or that use of discipline, we see children with disabilities. We also have corporal punishment that remains legal in the United States, in 19 states in the country in public schools, and in 48 states in the country in private schools. So we're seeing thousands of kids still being corporally punished in schools. And so how does all of this affect the kindergarten experience? How does all of this affect, right, the early grade experience? And I think that when we leave out the question of behavior and discipline, when we're envisioning like this joyful development, we're doing a disservice, because it does disproportionately impact the experiences of particular groups of kids, as I mentioned, of Black children, children with disabilities. Boys are certainly overrepresented. Some other children of color, depending on the age group we're looking at, Native American, Latina boys in some data sets as well. So really ensuring that one, we are attending to this issue. We are providing teachers with supports around this issue and supports around understanding behavior, right, and developmentally appropriate responses, but also supports around what the research tells us are biases in the ways that we see behavior. So we need to be aware of that part of the equation as well, right? It's not all about behavior. It's also about how we're perceiving behavior differently that's driving disparities.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you brought up, the idea of control and control for, control's sake. And I think, both teachers, but also administrators that are walking into, especially early grade classrooms and are looking for, something specific, having what I would say is just not really the right expectations for what children can realistically do. And when it comes to, sitting still and being quiet and just what what control of a kindergarten classroom should actually look like. I think is something that there's a lot of misunderstanding out there for, you know, for any kid at that age, like what is really possible and what we should be expecting from them. Gloria, I want to bring you back into the conversation, and I know that you've recently finished a survey of Latino families in California who have low incomes, and how they've really grappled with post-pandemic life. I'd love for you to just talk about their experiences and what you've learned.
Sure. So we do these community needs assessments on a regular basis, and they're really conversations with families. These conversations are so important because it really enables us to, as a trusted partner in their child's learning and in the community, for families to tell us what they're worried about, what their hopes and aspirations are, and what resources they need as they're managing, you know, the day-to-day demands of multiple jobs, concern about health and safety, all these other issues that impact a child's ability to thrive and a family to thrive in their community. And so I want to just sort of share with you very, very quickly and it's embargoed, so so please know that this is not yet for distribution. I hope you're seeing the survey results, Laura. And this just tells you a little bit about who our families are. And these are the really key results, right? And the things that I will point out to you, especially among our youngest children and their families, is the concern about safety. And, you know, that really kind of plays into or dovetails the work that Dr. Meek mentioned about discipline, about the ability to be safe, what's considered appropriate behavior. The other really important thing, I think, related to our work with families is that somehow some of us think that the digital divide closed the minute that children went back to in-person schooling. And this tells us it hasn't, both because families still are on the wrong side of the digital divide. These are low income, mostly Spanish speaking families. There were 980 interviews that were conducted, before I forget to mention that. But you can see whether it's not having an email address, not having technology that belongs to them, not having high-speed internet. These are all things that really get in the way of developing these trusting relationships that support a family's ability to engage in a meaningful way with their school partners, with the teachers. I think the really kind of the other really important element about the work about this community needs assessment is that, you know, we let me tell you that we did a the analysis by grade span. So while we have concerns about safety, you know, they begin very early on from the earliest grade. They just get stronger, as you can see on this, or more acute as the families see their children progress into the higher grade. So what does this really tell us? I think it tells us two things. One is that in order for us to really develop these strong relationship with families, we really need to see families and communities holistically. And that's really important because, again, as I said earlier, and Dr. Meek mentioned, it's about expectations and biases and perceptions, right? All of which get shifted when you actually have a conversation with families about what their life is, what their journey has been, and what their hopes and aspirations are for their child. I think I have yet to meet a parent or a caregiver or a grandparent who doesn't want a better future for their children, for themselves, for their family, and for their community. And most educators are doing work because they believe fundamentally that their contribution is to support a child's ability for a better future. It's that point of departure, that shared point of departure, that means these practices that both Anya and Chantel have talked about can really create the kind of dialogue that is about shifting mindsets and, importantly, changing behaviors. You can shift your mindset and not change behaviors, and we are no better off, because it's what happens in the interaction, especially around issues that impact Black and brown boys. Although we're seeing girls, Black girls and Latinas, young Latinas, really starting, especially in the middle school, suffer some of these consequences around harsh discipline. But it's not until we change our construct and our mindset about what and how behavior looks like, what and how engagement looks like, that we can really then have a dialogue about what families are saying are their biggest concerns, what they want resources about. And I will tell you, especially for low-income families, they want resources on how to support their child's learning. Oftentimes those resources aren't accessible to them because it's sent on an email, which they don't have. It requires videos that they can't click on because they don't have broadband internet, right? Because there are these very true and significant barriers to access that, as we think about, especially as we think about our audience who's here, that asking ourselves, what assumptions are we making about the families we serve and how we can engage them, still remains a vital part. Just like our kindergarten teachers, our first grade teachers need to ask themselves that question about, what am I assuming? What am I expecting of the recent immigrant, the African-American child, and how am I making sure my pedagogy, how I approach that child's learning, reflects where they are, because we are going to the same place, right? I am taking every child on a journey that takes them to be able to thrive in their school community with the help and support of the family community, right? I think that's sort of the disconnect that often happens in curriculum in particular, because the teacher is the curriculum person, right? They develop curriculum, they develop content, they supplement it. And often that means that then taking the next step of sharing it and having a dialogue with families about how they engage in this content often tends to be, understandably, a very substantial barrier because of time, because of constraints, because of language, but they're not insurmountable, right? I think if the pandemic taught us anything, is the ability of a massive system to rethink and pivot literally on a dime, some better than others, don't get me wrong, but it tells us that it's possible. It tells us the ingenuity and creativity to do it is there. I want to end with just inviting us to understand that it is the mindset about how does practice look different will depend on what are my beliefs and my expectations and my biases about what's possible for a child with special needs, about a child or a community that is low income, and a child in a community that, whose home language and history is one I don't know, because the data shows, right, that teachers largely don't reflect the community that they serve, especially if they're low income and especially if they're multilingual learners. And so I think as we transition into, what gives us hope, I think understanding that these are human attributes that are changeable and mutable, that enable us to really think about how families want to be part of the enriching and the supporting for their child and for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Gloria. Anya, you, as you said, you lead SEAL, and can you talk about, let's talk a little bit about alignment and the importance of that, especially for dual language learners, but just, also benefits for, for all kids.
Great, yes. And I just want to pick up the thread around discipline, because one of the things we see over and over again is that discipline issues go down when we work with schools to enact this really engaging, rich, joyful, language-rich learning. Because often kids are underengaged, and that leads to what some teachers perceive as discipline issues. So just wanted to pull that thread in. Our approach, SEAL's approach, is rooted at the intersection of educational equity and research. And our mission, as you stated, is for all dual language learner, English learner children to learn, thrive, and lead. So we partner with early learning programs and elementary schools and systems, and we work across them to center the assets and needs of linguistically and culturally diverse children. These systems are separate, the early learning and K-12, and have essential perspectives to contribute towards creating a new, more powerful vision of schooling for dual language learners during the developmentally crucial years of ages 3 to 8. Key contributions to this vision from the early learning field, as we've heard, include a developmental perspective on early learning, the commitment to child-centered pedagogy, and the play-based learning that many have talked about and has been highlighted in the chat. And the deep connection between play-based learning and inquiry hands-on learning, a deep understanding that children, as we've been discussing, are part of families, the recognition of the key importance of relationships and learning, and the embrace of socio-emotional domains of child development. From the K-12 system, there's a civil rights history, a system of laws and guidance and infrastructure for protecting equal educational opportunity for students facing a language barrier, focusing attention and accountability on meeting the needs of English learners. Within the K-12 system, there are decades of experience in building practices and program models for dual language and bilingual education, for second language development, the scaffolding of comprehension and participation in academic learning. The K-12 system is standards-based and outcome-focused, where we have clearly defined knowledge and skills related to English language development and well-developed guidance on instruction, program design, and pathways. So SEAL's approach to P3 alignment knits these different systems together in ways that transform both early learning education and the primary grades, drawing upon the strengths of each. We're grounded in an overarching instructional learning vision across these grades, and we're working to enact it systemically. Our focus is on the learning, the classroom, so that the experiences of children and families reflect this comprehensive research-based instructional learning vision. We believe deeply that this work must happen systemically. Often in education, we silo things, we separate. So the classroom and instructional practice is thought of as separate from the systems work. And the systems work is seen as structural and technical, the policy work, funding, workforce, and governance, to name a few. For SEAL, we push ourselves to counter this siloing tendency, to center the classroom and the learning at the core of our strategy to be child-centered. Therefore, we work to center instructional practice within our systems approach. So we use a systems lens as we work to implement our comprehensive research-based instructional learning vision. To do so, we aim to work across the system, across the levels, the people, the actors throughout the system, to ensure that the change and transformation of classrooms and learning experiences are systemic. That means working across teams of teachers, building collaboration structures where teachers can learn, reflect, plan, and support each other. This work should not happen in isolation, and teachers far too often work in isolation, as we know. So we work on alignment within grade levels, across grade levels, and then of course, across early learning programs and elementary schools. At the core of our alignment approach are a set of research-based pedagogical practices that build powerful, engaging, language-rich, joyful learning. And the goal is for children to experience this pedagogy across preschool through the early grades in developmentally appropriate ways. An overview document of these pedagogical practices will be dropped in the chat box. These are the foundation of our work. We create professional development opportunities for teachers within systems and across systems to build their capacity. We also work with administrators, our systems leaders, to build the professional infrastructure so that teachers have the conditions to successfully implement. And this work, of course, has to happen, as we've heard, at both the mindset and the behavior level. So this professional infrastructure includes release times for professional development training, which is the most obvious element. But what is so critical and so widely lacking is the teacher collaboration time, the time for teachers to plan together, to make meaning of the information shared in the trainings they participated in, their hands-on learning time, the time to observe each other, to reflect together on student learning, and of course, the critical importance of effective coaching. SEAL works to enact a P3 alignment that centers dual language learners through partnering with programs in school to build this kind of systemic professional learning and infrastructure.
Thanks, Anya. And I know I want to talk, you've talked a lot about implementation and how systems can really support that high quality implementation at the classroom and instructional level. I'm wondering, this is a little bit different question than kind of what we talked about, but at the state level, like what do you think is the most important role for states when we're talking about supporting the local systems that you just talked about, but what at the state level, what are those state systems that really can change to be more supportive of the local work as you described it?
So it's critical that our state and local policies support that programs and practices are designed and delivered based upon the actual knowledge and research and expertise specific to dual language learners and English learners. These children must be centered in the system as the shared responsibility of all. They must be fully integrated throughout the school program with structures and supports that ensure full participation and maximum integration with other students. All educators in our systems, not just the English learner specialists, are responsible for ensuring appropriate and effective instruction. But our systems have not historically been designed to center and to fully serve our diverse children and families. They were not designed to be pluralistic. This is something that I think is really important that we keep in mind and continually remind ourselves of. In California, we have a powerful research-based inspirational state policy, the English Learner Roadmap, which was adopted in 2017. This is a P12 state policy that's grounded in knowledge, research, and expertise specific to dual language learners and English learners. And yet we see many classrooms where the conditions are not set for this policy to be implemented effectively, so that the experiences of children and families reflect this vision. If you would please drop the link to the California's EL roadmap in the chat for those of you that are not familiar with our state policy. So the notion of being asset-based is generally agreed upon, something that might not sound controversial or complicated until we unpack how deeply deficit-oriented our practices, our systems, and our mindsets have been and remain. And I'll borrow the well-known notion that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it does. Fundamentally, our education systems and our practices have been designed to standardize, to assimilate, to track, to elevate and prioritize English and normative American culture at the expense of other home languages and cultures. what has been called at times subtractive schooling, a deeply deficit orientation. So it's critical that we are wide-eyed about that, what this work entails at all levels, and that we are clear that our state policies are extremely influential, but it is in understanding the practices at the local level that continue to perpetuate much of the subtractive schooling.
Thanks, Anya.
Yeah, just a bit more, if you don't mind. I just wanted to share that, you know, educational research tells us over and over again that implementation is the hardest part. That's something that we see in all sorts of educational research, all sorts of interventions, that it's in the implementation where the rubber really hits the road. So it's really essential that in this approach to comprehensive systems and a P3 continuum that is well aligned, that is joyful and developmentally appropriate, informed, and equitable, that we remain so committed to a hard, messy work. That's part of it, and that we really understand this systemic professional learning and the professional infrastructure that's needed to implement sustainable change.
Thank you for that, Anya. And I want to bring both Gloria and Chantel back and just get some thoughts from you on, you know, state and local policy, and how, you know, Chantel, I'd love for you to talk about just how, you know, state and local communities can better support really inclusive environments in schools. And then Gloria will come to you to kind of talk about supporting more meaningful family engagement. And while you're thinking about responses, just want to remind our audience that in a few minutes, we'll be opening up for Q&As from you. So start thinking about those and putting them in the Q&A box. So Chantel.
Thanks, Laura. So I'll focus on kids with disabilities, but before I do, just on the discipline point, thinking just more broadly, including kids with disabilities and kids without disabilities, really thinking about addressing at the state level, not just the rates, but the disparities. And I think that is what we have failed to do collectively as kind of folks in policy. The vast majority of policy has been directed at rates, decreasing the number, which in one sense, great, like we made progress on that point, on the intent, right? But in another sense, that disparities will continue untouched if we are not explicit and intentional in addressing specifically the disparities that we're seeing in discipline. To kids with disabilities and inclusion in that sense, I know the question was for states and localities, but a great start would be for Congress to fully fund the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. At what the percentage is in the law, the upper limit of the federal government, which I believe is about 40%. Going down from there, right, the federal government and federal agencies in particular can give more guidance, direct more resources, and really embed it, full inclusion in monitoring and accountability, which right now, inclusion or least restrictive environment is not considered in redetermination for state funding, which again is another important and missed opportunity on that sense, because we see inclusion as a basic civil right? And that includes, you know, from the youngest children all the way up across the continuum. And so for states and localities alike, right, it's part of it is really operationalizing equity, as I said, and embedding that across all of our levers. So what does that mean in our expectations and our standards for our various programs? What does that mean in our budgets? What does that mean in our TA and our coaching and our training infrastructure? What does that mean in our workforce preparation and professional development? Kind of how do we embed this in an operationalized, actionable way, right? Across all of the different policy levers that we have. I think when we think about kids with disabilities in particular at the Children's Equity Project, we focus kind of on these 5 dimensions where we do see inequities in opportunity. The first is really access to early intervention and preschool special education, we see racial disparities in particular there, where generally we see this pattern where children of color are underrepresented in early intervention and preschool special education, and then overrepresented when you get to the K-12 space. White children, it's the reverse. They are overrepresented in the early years and then underrepresented in K-12. And if, you know, everyone in the room, right, we know the importance of early intervention. We know the importance of early brain development and those really early opportunities, and why that's so important, and why that pattern that we see quite consistently is really problematic. And so thinking about access first, thinking about appropriate and accurate identification, right? We have a various complex mix of over or under identification based on group, based on disability type, based on context, right? So ensuring we have, right, we have people who are doing the assessments, people who are doing the evaluations, who understand the home language that children speak, right? Who can communicate with families and use that information as part of the evaluation process, to ensure we have a more accurate identification, which then feeds into the services that kids get, right? And so the third piece is quality of services. What is the dosage? Are you getting a half-hour speech a month? And is that enough, right? And is that really what kids need? And what does the dosage look like? What is the language that those services are being delivered in? If we think there is a shortage of dual language instruction in early care education and in the K-12 space, early intervention and the special ed system as well, right? We have a big shortage there. The fourth is discipline, which we have already talked about, really thinking about discipline broadly, and for kids with disabilities in particular, restraint, seclusion, and exclusionary discipline. And the fifth is inclusion and receiving services in a general education setting. So the federal government collects data on the percentage of time kids spend in a general education classroom, and we have a huge variability across the country. Everybody's operating under the same federal law, but the percentage of kids who are spending most of their day in general education settings ranges from like 44% to 84% in different states across the country. And so that's a problem. We also see racial disparities with respect to who is getting to spend most of the day in the general education setting, with children of color, Black children, Latino children being less likely to spend most of the day in general education settings and more likely to spend it segregated away from their peers without disabilities. And so when we think about it, right, there are some really clear, like, established inequities that we have seen that have been consistent in services and systems for kids with disabilities in the K-12 system or the pre-K-12 system. And so really, again, to the point of operationalizing equity, right, where are our intervention points, right, specifically, and where should we be investing? I think the last thing I'll say is, you know, this is about kindergarten and the early grades, but preschool special ed in particular is really segregated, right? Most preschoolers with disabilities are getting their services in segregated or self-contained settings. That actually increases and it improves once you get to the K-12. But we also know that there's some research that finds that inclusion in preschool, right, can predict and is associated with being included in K. And so it really sets the trajectory. So if we are starting off segregated, right, we are undercutting this from the beginning. And so really making sure we're paying attention to that preschool, that 619 Part B program, and being inclusive there to set the trajectory in an inclusive direction from the beginning. And the last thing I'll say is that National Academy's report goes into depth on IDEA and inclusive services for kids with disabilities in the early grades as well. And there's a whole lot of policy recommendations in there for states and localities.
Thanks, Chantel, and you're absolutely right. The important role of the federal government too. We don't want to leave out IDEA and the other important laws in place that can be improved or fully funded. Gloria.
You know, I think that there's a few things that that can happen really at the state and local level. I'm going to start sort of with, again, just sort of telling you, sharing with you kind of where families are when you ask them this question, which is, what are the areas of support, right? They want to have policymakers and district and state leaders really support home language. That's how they're included. That's how they believe they can be part of the work of enabling a child to thrive, right? And be a partner in this effort. So it's, bilingual programs, having a strategy where you honor and value bilingualism and multilingualism, translation, and obviously bilingual staff, really as a way of making the connection between home and the community and the education environment. And obviously academic supports, right? There's still a really strong need to understand how best families can engage in supporting a child's learning through dialogue. So I just wanted kind of to ground our work in this, in our research. But let me tell you very specifically, there are 3 strategies that we know actually shifted the way, especially during the pandemic, where families were actually able to be included. One was home visit. I don't know how many of you all might remember doing a home visit, or if you've decided not to continue that practice because it was a COVID specific intervention, right? Because you needed to quote unquote find the children, right? Home visits are critical. An active strategy of understanding children and families is to get to know them, right? The other is really around consistent and multiple ways of communication. And again, we did this much more effectively during the pandemic, and we have kind of retreated from that. Using social media, using information through text, using these ways of actually reaching families instead of the standard robocall that many of us got. I'm a mom of 2 children, so I got plenty of those. But really text messaging, social media, consistent multilingual communication. I will tell you one practice that happened to be very, very successful that we have shied away from was weekly communications from the principal and the district. Why? It happened as a result of not knowing whether or not your school was going to be open or not on Monday, right? So there was a practice that a lot of districts implemented, that every Sunday at 4 o'clock, there was a message, right? Let me tell you, those messages have stopped. Why? It's not because communicating with families is any less relevant or important. The other big investment that we've seen really kind of dissipate is really continuing to invest on parent liaisons, some of whom are here with us today, right? Really having a way of the district to have an intentional way of reaching out to families consistently by families, by other parents, is a critical strategy that brings families to the dialogue, to the conversation consistently. It develops trust, especially as you said, right? In a system that is producing exactly the outcomes it is set up to produce. Inequitable outcomes for young children is what this system is set up to do. And it is doing it quite effectively, right? And so in order for us to change that, we need to then, just like we need to change our behavior and our mindset, is to put in those practices that actually work, right? Is to invest in the infrastructure through parent liaisons, through multiple communication channels, multiple languages, right? And I would say, really thinking about, especially for low income and multilingual learners, is how a district and a state is thinking about partnerships. And I will tell you this, especially as we think about this pivot from COVID, right? The reason why there were really strong partnerships was because all of a sudden you had to really understand health and vaccination and protocols, right? And safety and wearing masks and all these things, right? So there was a very intentional reason why those partnerships at the district and at the state level happened. Again, this is a practice that the state and the districts can maintain, Another big area of support, for example, someone put it in the comments, are mentors, right? Bringing in your community-based organizations to do mentoring, to support families in issues that they're facing, housing insecurities, food insecurities. These are things that the school, the district, and the state may not be able to tackle on their own, but bringing in these partnerships with those community-based organizations that will enable the school, that will enable the district to be reflective of the holistic needs of the communities. I really believe that teachers and educators can't be everything. I know that there's a mantra that they're asked to do everything. Well, they're asked to do everything if they don't reach out, right? If they don't get to know their mental health provider in the community, right? They're asked to do housing supports if they don't know that there's a housing organization in their neighborhood, right? So I would invite us to continue to think about what are those strategies that we did and that we have stopped doing because we're no longer in a crisis. Well, I would present to you that we continue to be in a crisis. It's our mindset that needs to shift so that we can continue to implement really more robust investments in these practices so that families could be at the core, because children are at the core, right?
Yeah.
So I will leave you with one great reading resource. Don't Look Away. It's about embracing an anti-bias classroom. And I think what you heard from Anya and certainly from Chantel is that until we really think about what does anti-bias and anti-racist classrooms and strategies look like, we are going to be working as if we had a monolithic white English speaking community.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, coming from California, 30% of children under 5 in this state, the 4th largest economy in the world, are white and English speakers. 50% of children in California don't speak English as a home language. So we have to really hold ourselves, I think, as educators, as policymakers, as practitioners, to revamp and implement some of these practices where families had to be at the center, because children's well-being, their ability to connect, was predicated on families being the vehicle for that to happen, especially with our youngest children, because I never met a kindergartner that was able to manage teams on their own without some adult support, even if it was an older sibling, right? So again, we know that it can be done. I invite us to hold ourselves again to implementing those practices.
Great. And I was just going to ask you to put that book in the chat, but it looks like Hillary did it. So great to have that resource, because I'm sure our audience will be interested in looking that up. Okay, we're going to turn to some audience Q&A. And so I'd invite Chantel and Gloria's on and Anya to come back. We have a question from Holly Blum that says, so does this mean that the system doesn't value and understand, and thus PD and collaborative time is not accessible? I think going on, have you found more success in schools that embrace a community schools approach? So wondering about, systems and PD and collaborative, is it better, do you think, or have you seen in schools that embrace a community schools or a full service kind of school approach?
I'll jump in and I'll turn it over to our other colleagues. The short answer is yes and possibly no. Right? This is why. Yes, when you actually think of community schools, not as a program. California and a lot of places across the country are going appropriately, well invested into this strategy. The conversations I've been in have been about, well, how do you implement this program? And it is, I will tell you, the death of a great idea when you think that it is a program without the shift of practice and mindset. The reason why community schools have been so successful, especially in low-income multilingual communities, is because they actually bring families and talk to them in their home language. They have teachers and educators who reflect their community, but more importantly, reflect the values that they want the community, the school community to reflect, right? It's where they have food pantries. It's where they have supports for health, right? It's because the school becomes a hub of the community, right? So yes, it's an incredibly successful way of bringing families and children to the core of what education means. It is less so when you think that you're going to bring in a program without shifting what happens in your practice through team meetings, right? Before and after school, when it's, as Anya was saying, collaborative professional development, right? Where teachers get a chance to see the 3 children from the same household in first, in kinder, and in 3rd grade, right? So I would say yes, and, it's all in the approach. So, that's what we have seen in the work that we've done nationally. And I think because it can work, my aspiration is that the investments that are going in will mean that those practitioners are really seeing this as a shift in their practice and mindset.
So I'll just build from there and share that, we're often trying to connect that notion of community schools, which historically is kind of seen as this wraparound, and really thinking about how are we pushing that so that there's connection points into the classroom. And then, of course, as we've been saying through and through the webinar, how are we centering families and children within the classroom so it's linguistically and culturally sustaining, and making all those connection points. And the more that we think of these things as separate, oh, these are wraparound services for families, but community schools isn't about the core of learning. We miss the power of the strategy. We miss the power of the investment. Certainly, we miss the opportunity to transform what's happening in schools. So I would also just to say in terms of professional development and professional infrastructure that I was describing, absolutely. Valuing ultimately means investing in and having sustained investments to create what I'm calling a professional infrastructure. And so when we look internationally at other systems that we try to uphold as these like highest quality systems, we see very different amount of time for teachers to do, and for educators and for everybody working in the school to do the complicated, complex work of organizing their time, of differentiating, of adapting their curriculum, of collaborating across the school community. So what does it look like? Unfortunately, in the United States and in many places, school districts, have flavor of the year, flavor of the season kinds of initiatives that come in and out. And so that doesn't support the kind of infrastructure that I'm describing, where it's really an ongoing commitment and vision of education, and then an investment to support the complicated work to do so.
And I'll just echo, I don't have that much more to add. I would echo what both of my colleagues just mentioned. And Gloria and I have talked about this in the past, but like that, thinking about the Head Start model in particular and how that is such, it has infrastructure for family and parent and community engagement, right? There is like a person, there's like a family coordinator in every Head Start program. There is a family advisory council. There is a family policy council, and these folks make decisions about the program. There is parent advocacy that is part of being involved with Head Start. And so there's these specific investments in parent and family leadership. There is parent and family decision making, and then there is support, right, for the whole family, whether that is for health insurance or for education or whatever it is, job training or housing support or, food pantry, whatever it is, right? There is that understanding that that the child obviously, right, lives in the context of their family, and we care about the whole family, and we wrap the whole family and build right on all of the great assets and ensure those needs are met. And so of course it's not a perfect model, and implementation is not perfect, and it's not consistent everywhere, but the model at least, right? And how can we bring that concept and that kind of mindset and that infrastructure and that funding, right, together with the K-12 system? Because so often we do hear that it's kind of a cliff, right, once kids enter kindergarten and go into the K-12 system with respect to all of these other things, especially when you look at Head Start. So really thinking about how we can take that model as well, right, and build that as part of this community school model. And it's not just co-location of health or mental health services, but it's all of this other stuff that goes with meaningful partnerships and decision-making and advocacy for parents and families.
And thanks to all three of you for your responses. And I'll just add that, you mentioned funding to, Chantel, and just, how to really extend something like the Head Start model into K-12 and thinking about, community schools as just one, approach, but really the strategies in place are what's really important in that. And the federal government does have the full service community schools competition. I'll just offer that, that's out right now, and an invitational priority in that competition now is Kindergarten as a Sturdy Bridge, to potentially, connect something like a Head Start or a pre-K program with comprehensive services into, K in the early grades, and thinking about that more strategically. Oh, am I muted? Oh, I accidentally muted myself. I meant to hit, I'll put it in the chat that this is something that communities can, start thinking about, right, how to potentially do right now. So we haven't yet brought in our teacher, Connie, but I want to make sure that we do that before we close out. And so before we go to our final question with all of you, really asking what's giving you hope right now, as we move forward. I'd like to play just some comments from Connie Hall on what she'd really hope to see change at the school level to better support kindergarten students and teachers. So if we could play the last video there from our teacher, Connie Hall from Nevada.
But having a principal being supportive of kindergarten, I think it's vital for a successful kindergarten program, because if a principal is not supportive, then you just have a glorified first grade classroom and you're not getting that. So as I said, this year I've had a principal that taught those grades, so they're understanding. Previously, I had principals that did not have that understanding, but they were supportive of me. They respected my they respected me as an educator, that what I was doing. And when I was teaching that, I always had a standard, whatever I'm doing. If they're doing this, here's a standard. So it got to the point, if I would do certain things, my principal said, I know you're going to be doing things that are going to go with learning, because Mrs. Hall has probably attached this to a standard. I know. And it wasn't even a question after being respected as an educator. So having principals understanding, and I think if some do not have that understanding of early childhood education, even though it goes up to age 8, which is around 3rd grade, that needs to be a part of their becoming a principal, to have that understanding of what kindergarten is, maybe why it doesn't look like some of the other classrooms, even still there, and that will help the teachers. And I've seen teachers, I actually have one at our school this year, they actually left, they loved kindergarten, but they left kindergarten and went to another grade, even though they loved it, because of so many challenges that are there for kindergarten. I've seen some I talked to, and they're like, they had all the dramatic play, all of the centers, the principal has it stored up. And I said, if these principals only knew, and that's saying that principals need to be educated before they're allowed to be a principal in in a setting. Even up, like I said, for most of our elementary schools are K and they go to 5. So you think K 1, 2, 3, those are all early childhood. And how is somebody going to be allowed to teach in, with a setting that 4 of your grade levels are early childhood and they have no understanding of it? And even some coming in, because you have some that are teaching, kindergarten, but they have an elementary background. Most of our principals are elementary background. And I was fortunate that I got a degree in early childhood and elementary background to give me that broader spectrum of what was taking place. But your principal can make or break your program. And they can either help it to be successful by providing you with the things and not just, feeling that teachers are playing. Oh, the kids are just playing. But if you could see the different things that they're learning when you're asking the questions and you're seeing those, some of the kids, your future architects, your future things, how they're learning, some of your future doctors over there in the dramatic play, and they're doing some of the things that they're going to need those skills when they get into those jobs later. So I think they need to educate some of the principals more since they're in that type of setting.
Okay, and that Hillary put some information about Connie and where she teaches in the chat. And just for our final question here with Gloria, Chantel, and Anya, I'd love for you to just give, a minute on what gives you hope for moving beyond, the challenges that we know get in the way of expanding the number of well-aligned, joyful, equity-focused, equity-centered, and developmentally informed pre-K through 3rd grade classrooms. Who wants to start?
I'm happy to jump in. What gives me hope are the children, the joyful classrooms, the teachers, the leaders, and the school communities who commit to the work for the long haul. When I have the privilege and opportunity to observe classrooms, or even when I take a moment to look at some of the videos of classroom practice that we've created, and we have a host of them on our YouTube station. I'm reminded what is possible when we truly ground in assets, in seeing children for all of their potential across their multiple languages, cultures, and worlds, in seeing teachers for all their potential. The vast majority of people in our school communities want to create equity-oriented educational systems. And when we put the pieces together to create the conditions to enact this joyful, developmentally appropriate, aligned, equity-focused early learning and elementary continuum, the results are incredibly hopeful. And I will just share a quick plug. We will be releasing, SEAL will be releasing a P3 English learner, dual language learner framework later this fall. So please sign up for our newsletter to stay tuned. You can do that. I think the link to sign up will be dropped in the chat box.
I'll go next. What gives me hope, I think there's 2 things that give me hope. One is that the work has begun, right? That the movement forward has started. So that gives me hope. I think the other thing that gives me hope is that there's really a growing conversation about the fact that systems are made of us, of people, right? And the recognition that means that what felt like it was intractable now is really a difficult matter, don't get me wrong, but like what gives me hope is that it is about changing our perspective through collaboration. And I just want to shout out to Ms. Lee, who talked about how important it is to see ourselves as a community from early childhood in terms of community providers, that have sort of a critical tapestry to support our TK, kinder, and beyond education partners. And so that gives me hope. I think the growing recognition that we are one system, and that our policies are reflecting that, that our language is reflecting that, is really important. And I think the final thing, I think that's very similar to Anya, what gives me hope is that I see every day, we serve at PreK 25,000 families a year in California, and we partner with 14 states across the country. Knowing that families' ability to support their child's learning is something that is present, that it happens every day, despite challenges and barriers, means I am hopeful to each of us making a different choice, right? The choice is us, and the choice is to hold each other accountable. You know, all of you can turn back and say to your principal or to your district liaison, why are we not funding these strategies, right? Like, that question is really what gives me hope. Why can't we, right? Now we can say we did it once, and if we haven't done it, I think it's an opportunity to do so.
Thank you. And Chantal, you get the last word here.
Well, Connie gives me hope, and all of her amazing work. And Gloria took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say the same thing, right? We don't know everything, but we know some things, and we know that we can do better, right? It's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of fact. We know biliteracy is good. We know inclusion is a civil right. We know harsh discipline is bad. Like, these things are complex, yes, but we also know that there is a divide between what we know and what we're doing, right? This is not an intractable problem. And as Gloria said, right, it's a choice. And so there's hope in that, right? And hope that we can choose to do better and use the information we have to really align practice and policy more.
Thanks to all of you. And I will turn it over to Hillary to close us out.
Thank you so much, Laura, and to our panelists and to all who joined us. We want to say thank you for your time and energy and thoughts today. I will be very quick and just say, join us for one of our upcoming sessions. We have our session next week is at 12:30 Eastern time. What does it mean to drive systems change in digital access? We're at 3 p.m. Eastern time, technology assisted teaching and learning, continuing the conversation. And then also very important, save the date, July 17 through 21 is GLR week. I am sharing the link to register for the upcoming sessions in the chat. And I just want to say thank you for this thoughtful conversation today.